I'm always kind of upset with myself that when I listen back to my own recordings, that I didn't elaborate on certain points which were brought up and sort of add to the description of hypocrisy in the system and dysfunction and the kind of implicit mismanagement involved in the ideological circus that is the social justice movement and its policy that it cultivates. There are just sort of some minor points that I wanted to kind of use to supplement some of those extra bits of insight into all my kind of well, sometimes my rants are quite long, so, and I kind of touch on, and I try to illustrate many parts of the ideological makeup which can add to the kind of confusion, because sometimes I talk in the voice of the ideology to illustrate the kind of the philosophical attitude that is being that is generating what becomes a kind of systematic problem that becomes its own negative feedback loop. But okay, so I will say that one of the problems in identity politics is that because the essential truth of your group and your identity, in essence, should not be understood by some other privileged group. In fact, if it could be understood by a privileged group, then that means that it isn't your essential essence, because it has to be kind of distinctly unsubstantiated or unsubstantiatable to the outside. That's what makes the difference between the kind of the in-group and the out-group. And so the only thing that can happen instead is a kind of mirror sympathy for, oh, well, you have your essential truth and I have mine. And so identity politics really ends up kind of hiding itself behind these factional boundaries, in which there's no kind of there's no instrument or tool of universal communication apart from a kind of separate but equal, kind of mock respect. That is what respect gets reduced to, as this kind of you are your breed of pack mentality, and I am my breed of pack mentality, and I'll give you yours because you're going to give me mine, although you have a claim against me, and I should sympathize with that because we've influenced each other and we've degraded each other's purity of historical development because of the mixing, because of the unholy mixing, so you can see the kind of the pseudo-religious racism, that's kind of woven into the fabric of the social justice mindset. Every time I say social justice, I want to say so-called, because social justice does have a valid description somewhere, especially as it's used in the South African Constitution, and it's completely used out of context when it is quoted by people from this very racist and racialist ideology, and the Constitution of South Africa being a non-racialist document. It's okay, and I was going to go into the kind of... So this whole setup is the engine that just hollows out liberalism and liberal values. So it has to chew up and destroy liberal values, and catering to that kind of model of almost relativistic self-righteousness, which never has to be substantiated in any kind of universal reasoning way. So if you have to develop in such a way which could be understood by the privileged, it would by definition be a capitulation to that privilege, so you have to develop in such a way that is some form of revenge and damage to the other group. That's the only way that you can measure progress, is how much you've sort of damaged the other group. And I was going to make a point about compensation. So the compensation is only ever what essentially the only thing that can amount to valid compensation in this system is something that cannot be universally defined and regarded as, so you can see the kind of the implicit fascistic expression of the social justice project, that it will only solve itself when you've got some kind of fascistic compromise upon the political scene, and that is sort of stabilizing the social cultural integrity of the groups. I did want to make a more profound point also about the nature of this vision of compensation. Perhaps it's better to get into this in terms of a tangible example of, let's say, affirmative action. Now, I was just looking at some YouTubers who are kind of think that there's some kind of toxic identity politics, but there's also a version of identity politics which is somewhat justifiable, or kind of philosophically workable, or something like that. Now, let me just say that affirmative action, I'm not against affirmative action in principle, but and I'm just going to lay that out quite clearly, and I can tell you that affirmative action is, as it's been implemented in South Africa, has been this kind of terrible ideological pandering to identity politics, and so it's been used in wholly the wrong way, and it's really created a lot of internal ideological stress and motivation to aggravate identity politics even further. It's kind of masticized racism on a new kind of level. So I would say that affirmative action, for it to be successful in any liberal way, it has to be like a ninja. It has to be kind of, it has to attend like the problem at its source. And so when you see affirmative action as the tool of compensation for historical injustice, if it is a direct compensatory instrument, then it is not affirmative action in the principled sense of the South African Constitution even, because affirmative action is meant to be a bridge. And so when it is implemented in any of its implementations, it is meant to actively be the bridge between things, not a way to deconstruct privilege. It's not a tool of deconstructing privilege. It's a tool of bridging problems with solutions. And the problem is not historically defined. The problem is defined in reality in the present. And inasmuch as you can trace that problem in the present to correlating to historical things, yes, you have to overcome those challenges, but they are not defined by their history. What's the point of defining them by their history? They need to be tackled in their present manifestation, in their present condition, and those conditions are changing. And so you have to actually tackle them in the present, and you have to bridge from where you are, and it's completely irrelevant, let's say, some kind of historical narrative about that condition. I mean, it doesn't really offer any kind of tangible... why would you think that the solution and the problem would mirror each other? It would be some kind of perfect symmetry in terms of the historical account of the problem. Why would the historical account of a problem mirror the actual solution of that condition? So it's that's kind of conflating morality with practical common sense, really. And so when you make that the whole center of the universe, that you need to balance this morality, I mean, you have essentially completely overlooked even what conditions people are facing, and then you're going to tackle things in, oh, we need to compensate everyone directly. I mean, it is just what is the point of that in any case? Because you could compensate everyone directly, and you could end up in a completely worse situation at the end of doing that, because redistributing things and also the negative, the destructive aspect of that kind of negative integration, instead of actually working out, well, what is the opportunity for what can be done in the most effective way possible. And redistribution might be the most morally radical, but that doesn't make it the most economically radical even. In fact, I would argue that it is a greater injustice to overlook the real opportunity that the mixed condition of the present, because the present is always a mixed condition. I'm just going to use that as a shortcut to cutting through a lot of the kind of the ideological programming that goes into the social justice thing, that because you can have this kind of moral absolute breakdown of the past, you can impose a false dilemma of having to make that the only conduit to transformation, when it is in fact the conduit to artificial transformation that fails on its own merit and then has to double down on saying that, the problem was that just we weren't radical enough. That we didn't truly achieve a kind of equality of identity. And if we had just worked harder at forcing people to sympathize better, that would have engineered a better outcome on the ground for people. Okay, I'm sort of beating a dead horse a bit, but so let me just go back to the tangible example of affirmative action, is that what you would do, therefore, is you don't try to directly compensate and say, well, if history was some kind of alternative thing, someone like you would be in a different position, or there would be some kind of different statistical outcome. And you see, all these statistical analyses really are a tyrant's dream, because you don't actually have to diagnose any problems in a real way, and you can get away with just kind of some kind of group progress and the definition of some kind of group progress, and then you get basically just the creation of an artificial elite, which is itself so kind of insecure that it has to kind of reinvest perhaps into this ideological system just so that they don't get any heat themselves, so the rich political elites can sort of get away with it and scapegoat the convenient identity politics, fighting everyone off on one another, and keeping people in this kind of, there's this moral question about these different groups, and they need to find some kind of equilibrium amongst them in some kind of statistical way, which completely overlooks the individual, which completely means that you can just kind of crush the individual with some kind of central regulation of some kind of quota system or something similarly as disgusting, which completely destroys the ability to have a functioning private sector that actually builds things from the ground up, that actually is capable of being an organically grown economy that functions as a normal economy usually does, which is from small businesses that end up becoming medium and larger and taking on the big guys. It's completely impossible with the level of racist regulation and quotas. You can't do that, because as soon as you're a small business and you get someone some skills, they get stolen and headhunted, and for a small business that's incredibly unstable. You can't keep on training new people all the time just to have them headhunted, and so the kind of the toxic and the real, let's say the really good black professionals, they won't put up with this culture either, because they could go be a good finance people overseas, and they don't have to be looked at like, well, did they get their position because of this quota system? Anyway, so let me just say that the way to apply affirmative action is to keep it away, as far away from the workplace as possible, almost. Or when I say the workplace, I don't necessarily mean any kind of, because workplace can involve training, but that it's far, far away from, let's say, the labor market. So you can have it adapt the preconditions of the labor market, but it should not have any direct application to people who are, let's say, already at the point at which they are being employed. And so, you can the government should be subsidizing kind of extra education and training and such. And that should basically be packaged in to, for example, universities and technicons and things like that. Or they should be, the biggest kind of affirmative action way of doing things would be to focus on education at a primary and a tertiary level. That would really be the thing, is to perhaps even identify people who are probably going to be going to university, and to kind of find a way to give them, you really have to make the able more able. You have to identify able people, and then that is where the affirmative action is applied, and then you give them more so that they can be more able, and then you can actually grow the tax base, and then there's more left over, and there's more there's a wider foundation, and then there's also perhaps a trail of how people can, there's actually a set down regulation where it's not just you get this kind of statistical lottery of, are you going to be the one who gets handed the quota, or is it going to be, there's actually a genuine path for people to make it. And, we are so allergic to actually doing the work of setting down policy that actually gives people the access to the opportunity, instead of we just want to hand out the opportunity, and the government is going to be your friend in coercing the private sector to provide it for you. And the cost of that is basically economic growth. The cost of that is that the economy will always be in a kind of perpetual, insipid floundering, which then they can turn around and say, well, the business isn't really giving, like people who understand finance or economics on any level, and the kind of, and this toxic element in the labor market, every time government complains that the private sector isn't providing enough jobs, it really is laughable, because that is government's, that is literally government's intervention in the economy. And then they want to double down and say that there's some kind of racism that's keeping people down. Yeah, it's the government's racism. That's what it is. So at university, for instance, most of the affirmative action hopefully should have already occurred, like bridging courses, in terms of making people's degrees larger by adding curricular elements which help bridge certain things. The point is that you need to bridge people to the point at which the quality of their education is on par with the standard without lowering the standard. That is the point of affirmative action, is to raise standards, not to change the goalposts and then call people racist because changing the goalpost belongs to each racial group, and they have to have their own truth, and you will never understand it because you're privileged. You see, you don't have to justify, that's just bullshit, so that you don't have to justify lowering standards. And you don't have to, and you get really stupid people wailing about decolonizing science and math. You get this sort of ludicrous nonsense, and no one can actually say that's ludicrous nonsense, because because there's a built-in response that if you criticize that, you are by definition a racist, because you don't go along with identity politics. And so you get this kind of proliferation of bullshit, and this proliferation of racially infused resentment And yeah, I mean, it's all based on this kind of grand project of social justice, which will only ever find any kind of stability after it's completely destroyed liberal values. It's completely destabilized democracy in any kind of way that doesn't pander to fascistic demagogues and racialist tyrants who can get away with any kind of mismanagement and corruption. You know, because it's their job to care for their own people. So, you know, and they don't have to substantiate, in fact, they can't substantiate any of their policy in a way that would sympathize with the colonizer. You know, that's the tagline. So that they can, not sympathizing with the colonizer, and then they can build their little incandlo or whatever. I mean, well, I say little incandlo because the person who I'm thinking of, my head, Julius Malema, when he was just the president of the ANC Youth League, not even the president of the country, he already effectively had his incandla. He already had this mansion house, which the taxman doesn't know where he got the money from. You know, so I mean, it's really just a revolving door of people that can conveniently hold back any kind of tangible and artificial, any kind of tangible development, so that they can advertise this artificial direct compensation which must be delivered, the justice that will be delivered directly to the identity that deserves it. And they will fix all your problems for you. That is the promise. And in so doing, they remove accountability. They remove... you know, the government doesn't have to be accountable for making the able more able. The government can just sit there and it can say, whatever isn't going your way, it's because we haven't dealt with the privileged people harshly enough and radically enough. Let me be the filter for reality, and I will go as a representative of our group and our culture, and I will define everything that doesn't make us successful as racist. And so just give me your complaints and I'll turn it into a radical filter, you know, that you will never have to be offended and you will never have to feel bad about your culture. You'll never have to be threatened with adapting your culture or changing anything about what you define as your identity. And so, because that is the only thing true about you. That is essentially what they're selling to people, is that they have no freedom, they have no ability to expand that concept, to expand the concept of their culture. You know, they're very definite lines that if you believe that, you are a colonialist sympathizer. So, you know, you can do whatever you want. You must be free in your identity, but you can't mix it with other identities. You can't touch the privileged thing. That's the unholy object. You know, and so this conflation with privilege and evil is you know, this oversimplification of the world, which gives the tyrant an endless excuse to essentially do whatever he wants, as long as it's under the banner of projecting the power of his group. And, you know, if that means that, you know, you're going to have this handful of elites and a worsening condition for people who are deprived of opportunity at the bottom, who they don't have to give any kind of access to real capacity and to becoming more able, they just have to find a role for them. They just have to find a child's role for them. That's the fascistic vision of society, and this is also why masculinity gets kind of under siege, really. That there's this new vision of a kind of, you know, that women have this kind of political let me just find this, as I wrote a comment on this. I think I might as well add it here. the reason why masculinity is being reconceptualized in line with the social justice paradigm. I get the grammar slightly wrong because I'm trying to change the. In line with the social justice paradigm, masculinity is being reconceptualized, which is essentially in line with the fascistic social mores. So men need to become subordinate to a masculine system which provides its own overriding authoritarian intervention, tailored to bypass individual considerations and pander to identity-based complaints, imposing an external locus of moral guidance that men need not understand and to which they are expected to conform with, as part of their atonement for not generating a system that already delivered justice to everyone's identity. Ergo, masculine traits of independence are rendered as culturally vestigial, and the woman carries the role of exporting this moral authority onto an appropriate political ally that will take on the role of projecting the accountability in the masculine role. That will take on the role of projecting the accountability for the masculine role, of providing order and creative forcefulness onto the externalized political expectation of essentially the fuhrer that the fuhrer will hold. Essentially, women are being trained to culturally and politically cuck their mates by expecting a society to come pre-packaged with a demagogue whose role it is to deliver protection, care and social justice to her identity, which a man is not allowed to have an opinion about, so the possibility for a negotiated relationship that is even capable of making these expectations vulnerable is not on the table, i.e. symbolic castration and cuckoldry is the new norm. Okay, that was a bit turbulent, but that probably you can see the major substance of the claims that I'm making is that, and you can also see this in. This has always come with fascistic culture, that you've kind of had this weak male that's kind of and these very kind of and these women who are the fascist women were just like the feminists are in our society. They have they have that sort of Emma Watson presence and kind of borderline tendency, but it's kind of amalgamated into this political vehicle. So they have this will stick together for and so you can't, they're like as thick as thieves, and so you it's a very kind of dangerous cultural and political manifestation, because it's I think it's been described in some videos that I've watched that it comes almost from an evolutionary thing where women were essentially always valuable because of their reproductive ability. So they could get away essentially with mischief and with breaking the rules, and they could kind of help each other and with getting away with more by just kind of sticking together, whereas men have no incentive to stick together apart from some kind of principled reason, because if you let things fly as a man or whatever, it's going to lead to threats to your to either your children or your partner, or it's going to make you more vulnerable in some tangible way, because you have to deal with the tangible management of survival, and women can kind of count on their intrinsic value, which men don't have, which is also explains why there's this kind of men that act like women, and don't take on that kind of independent spirit of responsibility. They don't have the intrinsic value that women have, because they don't have the ability to to bear children. So from an evolutionary point of view, ovums and eggs are incredibly expensive, and male reproductive fluids or whatever are incredibly cheap, and you can even see this in the capitalist market today. I mean, where is the equality in that? If you want to get in some kind of artificial insemination, eggs are expensive and the other component isn't. So it's funny, I don't see the kind of the feminist equality pushing in that realm. And I would say that is almost kind of symbolic of the kind of the ludicrousness of the kind of the anti-realism that's built into a very kind of specious, emotionally argument-driven facade for what is essentially, I've already described it as a kind of borderline political vehicle. I was going to make another point. So that men... Just trying to think how to talk about this, but that the kind of the kind of the symbolism that goes with the feminization of men, I would say, to me, what it is signifying is that you have this kind of masculine admiration for a greater and pervasive masculine society. So, I mean, I find it very ironic that essentially what feminists want is a kind of hyper-masculine social order that is more masculine than men. That sort of that is so paternalist in its enforcing its social norms, that is on their side. So they've kind of got this kind of a codependence with this moral social order, and that is more masculine than men. And so that men, to be good men in this sense, they must have this kind of admiration to this external masculine moral paternity that just infantilizes them, and they must be happy about it. So they must be in admiration of this grand political masculine construct. And I mean, so I would say that that is probably by definition what I'm going to reduce and call the matriarchy. I think it's not far off to label that the matriarchy or the matriarchal concept. And as far as patriarchy has been denigrated, at least the patriarchy as it has existed under liberal values, I think that we can't expect anything better than that. I don't think humanity is capable of anything better than that. And obviously, people can't perhaps ideologically see that until we start experiencing it. But when you start living in a society without the rule of law, when you start living in a society that doesn't have liberal values, it only lasts as long as you have someone to beat up. It only lasts as long as you have someone that you're winning against. You have some kind of, we're killing the evil people, or we're hurting the evil men that have been getting their way all the time. Like until you have a kind of a target for your vampirism, as soon as that runs out, the whole thing looks kind of dry and stale. It doesn't quite have the same meat in it. It's like the kind of the fascist drive is, let's kill the cows and eat the meat, and hopefully while we're eating the meat, there must still always be meat to eat, so that no one remembers that, oh, well, when was the last time you had any milk? You know, milk doesn't exist anymore. Well, when you run out of meat, you really notice that the milk is gone and has been gone for a while. You know, and so that is essentially the kind of, there's also a parallel to that in the kind of the, you know, the conception that we've been hollowing out, the kind of the core spirit of our civilization, which, I mean, I still think you have to think of that as a kind of, you know, there's something in the soul that inclines us to Greek, you know, that we need that liberal freedom, and the kind of the idea that you're going to sort of maximize freedom by betraying liberal values, just because you can call yourself liberal and you can call yourself acting in the name of social justice, when effectively there's no difference in your philosophy than the racial bullshit that underpins, I mean, it's not even different from the Nazi philosophy. It's like not different at all. Okay, I'm just going to start repeating myself if I continue about the political story of how Weimar Republic was sort of destabilized into the kind of a culture that was capable of being tolerant of the Nazi coup. Because I'll still say that the only vote that they ever got, which was valid, which was 20% of the vote, and most of the population, when the coup happened, were just so beleaguered that, oh, maybe it'll end now. Maybe they won't have to listen to the social justice ranting, because, you know, they have power now. What could they still complain about? But obviously that's when it really just starts to begin again. You know, it's like that's when it really ramps up, and they have to reinventing the conspiracy, because it can't go on. You know, like it's not good enough. You know, you always have to be on the edge of some kind of liberation. So you have to keep on inventing what you are being liberated from, and if you can't keep on reinventing it, yeah, and people get exhausted by it, but they're at that point they're addicted. You know, there's kind of like you know, you have to have some kind of human sacrifice on a continual level just to keep the value in the system, because it comes from extraction. It comes from parasitic vampirism, essentially, and culturally it needs that. Just to sustain itself, you know, it's exactly like a fire. If it's not getting bigger, it's dying. And so it only actually works as a viable ideology when it's the underdog, when it's, you know, when it looks like it's on the downside, you know. So it's at its strongest. Yeah, just like the borderline personality disorder, it feels, you know, like when things are against it, then it's got the moral argument on its side, because, you know, like then it can make the biggest moral case is when, you know, when the chips are down, it's the easiest case to make, that, oh, obviously things are looking so bad for me because I've been victimized so much, so my argument is even stronger. And then the more and more power you get, the harder and harder it is, unless you keep on building up the boogeyman and you keep on building up the image of the scapegoat. Because you can only justify radical progress in the face of a starkly and vastly sophisticated system of oppression and denigration, you know, so that those things have a perfect moral symmetry within the ideology. And yeah, people don't like giving that up, because no matter what point you get, if you try to give that up, then nothing will mean anything. You'll have no way to communicate with the people around you. You'll have no way to measure progress and meaning in your life, because you've essentially given up to become running with your dog pack mentality. You have to, you can't give up that sense of integrity because that's how you've defined it. And so, to escape from that is almost impossible. You have to really say, oh, I was abducted at a young age and I was raised in a bunker by some crazy cult leader and now I have escaped. That's the only way that you can remove yourself from it, is you have to have that realization about it.